So it's been a few weeks since I've produced one of these Ukraine explainer videos, and it's because things have been moving very gradually over the past few weeks. The war has kind of ground to a slow war of attrition. But two really important things happened this past week, and to be clear, today is June 25th. So the two things that happened are first, that the Ukrainian side has decided to abandon the city of Sievierodonetsk in eastern Ukraine in Luhansk Oblast, where there's been this incredibly intense fight going on really for the last several weeks. And that's what this video is going to be about. The other thing that's happened, and I'm going to make a separate video to discuss this because it's an important topic in its own right, is that the European Union decided to give Ukraine candidate status. So again, in this video, I'll talk about Sievierodonetsk and the war on the ground, and in the next one, I'll talk about the European Union. So why is Sievierodonetsk so important? To be clear, as a city itself, unless you live there, it's not an especially important city. It's an important, within its region, it's an important transportation junction, and it's the last city that the Ukrainians controlled on the east side of the river there, and so important in that sense. The Russians have been trying to take it for several weeks now, and there's just been this war of attrition there where the Russians have been able to bring to bear massive amounts of artillery, which is really their advantage, and the Ukrainians have been trying to focus on what is their advantage, which is building-to-building fighting, which even with all the artillery the Russians are using, tends to take a very high toll on the troops of both sides. So lots of casualties. The big question really running into this last week is, are the Ukrainians at some point going to beat a tactical withdrawal, or are they going to keep on fighting as they did in Mariupol in the famous Azov steel factory there? Keep on fighting until those troops get surrounded and eventually are either starved out or just bombarded into oblivion or have to surrender. And there was some question about that because I think there was a notion that maybe the Ukrainian leadership was too unwilling to retreat for political reasons and maybe wasn't going to do the wise thing. Well, this week they did the wise thing, which is they said, okay, we've really done as much as we can do here. It's time to retreat. So in some respects, this is a big win for Russia. They've gained more territory. They're very close to taking all the territory that they claim in this region called Luhansk Oblast, and this is one of their stated war aims. And presumably, having taken Sievierodonetsk, the next battle will be in a fight a little bit further west in a place called Lysychansk. But I think the expectation is that Russia's going to take that territory as well, though it may take some time. At the strategic level, is this a Russian victory? And the argument is maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. But what's happening here with Sievierodonetsk is we've gotten a clear sense now of what Ukraine's strategy is, and there was a fair amount of uncertainty in this. The Russian strategy after the early days of the war shifted from 4 different fronts and tanks driving around and so on to this very slow, incremental, you just bombard things into rubble with artillery, and then your infantry moves forward 50 yards. And then you do it again, and they may move forward another 50 yards. It's quite clear now that while that sort of suits Russia's strength in artillery, the question is, does it suit Russia's weakness, so to speak, in the number of men it has dedicated to the war? Ukraine clearly is now focused on this idea of we're going to fight battles in cities where we can extract very high numbers of Russian casualties on the theory, on the strategy that if they can kill enough Russian soldiers, the Russian military, as it now stands, will be degraded to the point where it really can't fight the war anymore. And to go back, Russia went into this war with something on the order of 250 of these so-called battalion tactical groups of roughly 1,000 men apiece. But of course, a big chunk of any one of these battalion tactical groups is not actually fighters, right? They're logistical support, they're cooks, they're command units, medical help, and so on. So the numbers that we were getting out of Sievierodonetsk from the Ukrainian side is that as many as 200 Ukrainian soldiers were getting killed a day. If the number is similar on the Russian side, it does mean a pretty substantial degradation of the Russian fighting force. The question is, and I'm not enough of a military person to answer this, and I'm not sure anybody really knows this about the Russian military, including the Russian military, is, how long can they keep doing what they're doing with the force that they have and the losses that they're sustaining? Obviously, Russia has a very big population, and so one of the big questions that we've seen all along is, to what extent can they bring more troops to the front? That would require either some kind of new mechanism, such as a draft or conscription, which Putin clearly wants to avoid, but there may be other ways of getting more people to enlist. There's also an issue on the Ukrainian side, and it would seem that on both sides now, the best trained units have been degraded to the point where they're not really combat worthy anymore, and so troops are being thrown into the front with a lot less training. This is a war of attrition, but clearly the Ukrainian strategy now is to fight the war in such a way that it degrades the Russian troop numbers, right? The Russians are always going to have far more artillery than the Ukrainians and so on, but to degrade the numbers of Russian infantry to the point where they can't really take and hold the territory they're trying to take. A second part, I think, of the Ukrainian strategy in Sievierodonetsk is simply to hold the Russians long enough for more American and Western supplied artillery to get there. The Ukrainians reported, and I don't think anybody disputes this, being massively outgunned, 20 to 1 in terms of the number of artillery shells being fired in this battle over Sievierodonetsk. That's no way to win a war. And so one of the goals has been simply to keep things in place there while this long-range American artillery that's supposed to be showing up and more shells for artillery to get there. So that's, I think, probably the biggest challenge for the Ukrainians right now, is if they might, maybe, if they maybe hold an advantage in how long they can hold out in terms of troops, they're clearly at a disadvantage in terms of artillery and the shells for artillery, and the question is, to what extent can some of that be remedied? That's really where things stand. I think there's another long-term attrition question that relates to that, which is, again, the question of Russia being able to maintain its troop numbers versus, on the other side, the West's willingness to keep on spending money, sending supplies, weapons, money to the Ukrainians. We got one other interesting hint this week about, really, and this just comes today, about how Russia thinks the war is going. Obviously, in a war, people don't tell the truth about what they think is going on. They always claim that things are going well. But one of the things that apparently happened, according to the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense, is that Russia fired a couple of the leading generals in the region. In particular, this guy named Alexander Dvornikov, who had had a lot of success in Syria, and he was brought in April when the original Russian attack failed. So Dvornikov was the guy who was brought in to fix the situation in Ukraine, and he himself now has been removed, or so it appears. Exactly why he was removed, we don't know, but my sense is, it's not just a normal rotation if you fire somebody after, roughly a month or six weeks in command. He apparently, according to the British, is being replaced with a guy named Sergei Surovikin, who also had a lot of experience in Syria, was seen as having achieved a lot of gains there, and in the words of the British Ministry of Defense, it has been dogged with allegations of corruption and brutality. So in this changing of generals, on the one hand, you get a sense of, obviously, you don't change your generals when things are going great. You change them when you think things are going badly. So that's an interesting insight that we haven't had. I think the interesting question is does it mean a change of strategy and tactics? That we're going to have to wait and see. But that's the big development of this week. And just to recap, Ukraine loses an important but not really strategically important piece of territory. The The battle is now going to shift, a few miles towards the west to the next city. But potentially, at least, Ukraine has won sort of a tactical or maybe a strategical victory in the sense of how long it's taking Russia to achieve that and the cost at which they've achieved it. So that's how things look in the war this week. But to stress again, it's a war of attrition now. It's going to be about how many troops you can bring to the field and how well you can supply them with weapons, food, fuel, and everything else. And so I'll go back to an old cliche that I like repeating, which is amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk about logistics. This is in many respects now a logistical war, Western supply of the Ukrainians versus Russia's ability to continue to supply its troops with certain kind of weapons, and in particular to keep a supply of fresh troops to fight the war. So again, I'll make a second video talking about EU candidate status for Ukraine and what that means.